You wake up in the morning and look in the mirror, but the person staring back at you seems strange, like someone you should know, but don't quite recognize completely. There's an uncomfortable sensation of disconnection, as if you're living someone else's life, or as if you've lost some essential part of yourself along the way. It's almost a physical sensation, a restlessness in your chest, a constant question hammering in your mind. Who am I really? And why do I feel so lost within my own existence? This feeling of being lost in yourself isn't just passing discomfort. It's something that follows you throughout the day, that interferes with your relationships, that makes you question every decision, every reaction, every feeling. You find yourself analyzing your own responses as if you were a stranger observing from outside, trying to decipher patterns that should be natural but seem coded in a language you've forgotten how to read. And the more you try to understand yourself, the more confused you become, like trying to assemble a puzzle without having the reference image on the box. This disconnection from yourself affects everything. In relationships, you can't be authentic because you're not sure what authenticity means for you. At work, every decision becomes an internal struggle because you don't trust your own instincts. In personal life, even simple choices like what clothes to wear or what movie to watch become anxiety exercises because you no longer know what you really like, what you really want, what is really yours. It's like being an actor who forgot which character they were supposed to play, but the show must go on and everyone expects you to know your role. The mental exhaustion of this constant search for yourself is overwhelming. You feel like you're digging a hole deeper and deeper, searching for something that should be on the surface, something that other people seem to have naturally, but that has become a complex and frustrating mystery for you. Jean Piaget's most revolutionary discovery wasn't about how children learn mathematics or science. It was about how we construct our own identity through mental schemas that develop from birth, and why, when these schemas become disorganized or incomplete, we feel lost within ourselves, unable to access who we really are. Piaget discovered that our sense of identity isn't something we simply have, but something we actively construct through a continuous process of assimilating and accommodating experiences. And when this process becomes compromised, when our internal schemas become outdated or contradictory, we experience exactly this anguishing sensation of being lost in ourselves, as if we were foreigners in our own mind. Today, I'm going to show you how Piaget discovered the exact mechanisms by which we build and rebuild our identity throughout life, why you might be feeling this disconnection from yourself, and most importantly, how to use his discoveries to rediscover who you really are. It's not about discovering a fixed and immutable personality, but about understanding the dynamic process by which you create and recreate yourself constantly, and how to realign this process when it goes off track. It's about learning to be the conscious architect of your own identity instead of a passive victim of disorganized mental patterns. In 1920, in the improvised laboratory that Piaget had set up in the attic of his house in Geneva, an extraordinary situation was happening that would forever change our understanding of human identity construction. Piaget was observing his daughter Jacqueline, then only 18 months old, playing with a cloth doll she had named Bébé. What happened that day wasn't just common child's play, but a window into understanding how we construct our notion of self, and how, as adults, we can get lost in this construction. Jacqueline had put the doll to sleep in a small bed improvised with shoeboxes. She carefully covered the doll, gave it goodnight kisses, and then something fascinating happened. She began to imitate all the movements and sounds that the doll would theoretically make while sleeping. She closed her eyes, made soft breathing noises, and for a few minutes, she was no longer playing at being the doll's mother. She had become the doll itself. Piaget realized that Jacqueline was doing something much more complex than simply playing. She was experimenting with different aspects of identity, testing what it would be like to be another person, another being. More importantly, she was using what Piaget called symbolic play to construct and expand her notion of who she herself was. Through imitation and representation, she wasn't just learning about the external world, she was actively constructing her internal world, her identity. And Piaget began to suspect that this process never really stops. Even as adults, we continue using similar mechanisms to define and redefine who we are, just in less obvious and more unconscious ways. The problem arises when these mechanisms become rigid, when we stop symbolically playing with our identity and get trapped in obsolete mental schemas about ourselves. Observing not only Jacqueline, but hundreds of other children over the following years, Piaget identified that identity construction happens through three fundamental processes he called assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. Assimilation is when we take new experiences and fit them into the mental schemas we already have about ourselves. For example, if you see yourself as a shy person, you'll interpret social situations through that filter, assimilating evidence that confirms this self-image. Accommodation happens when an experience is so different that it forces you to modify your schemas about yourself. Perhaps you surprise yourself by being naturally sociable in a certain situation, forcing an accommodation in your self-concept of shy person. Equilibration is the process by which we balance assimilation and accommodation to maintain a coherent sense of identity. The problem Piaget identified, and which explains why you might be feeling lost in yourself, is that many adults get trapped in excessive patterns of assimilation. They stop accommodating, stop allowing new experiences to modify their self-image, and keep repeating old and limited versions of themselves. It's as if you were using an outdated map to navigate through your own personality. The streets have changed, new neighborhoods have been built, but you keep following routes that no longer exist, getting more and more lost. Or the opposite can also happen, excessive accommodation without sufficient assimilation, where each new experience completely shakes your notion of identity, leaving you without a stable sense of who you are. In 1925, Piaget documented a particularly revealing case involving a 4-year-old child named Laurent. Laurent had developed what his family considered a behavioral problem. He insisted on saying he was different people at different times of the day. In the morning, he was Laurent the builder. In the afternoon, he became Laurent the explorer, and at night he transformed into Laurent the artist. The parents were worried, thinking the child was confused about his identity. But Piaget saw something completely different. Laurent wasn't confused. He was demonstrating extraordinary cognitive flexibility, an ability to experiment with different aspects of himself without losing internal coherence. He had intuitively discovered that identity isn't a fixed thing, but a dynamic process of exploration and expression. Piaget followed Laurent for months and discovered that this apparent multiplicity of identities actually led the child to develop a richer and more integrated sense of self than children who fixated on a single rigid self-image. Laurent was naturally doing what Piaget realized many adults need to relearn: the ability to be flexible with their own identity, to experiment with different aspects of themselves without losing the internal thread that connects all these facets. When Piaget observed Laurent a few years later as a teenager, he found an exceptionally self-confident and creative young man who had learned early that being himself didn't mean always being the same, but rather being authentically responsive to different contexts and internal needs. This observation led Piaget to a revolutionary conclusion. The sensation of being lost in yourself that many adults experience doesn't come from having a weak or confused identity, but exactly the opposite. It comes from having identity schemas that are too rigid, that can no longer adapt to the new realities of your life. It's as if you were trying to force your current personality to fit into clothes you wore when you were 15. The clothes no longer fit, but you keep trying to wear them because they're the only ones you recognize as yours. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that you've grown beyond your old self-image schemas and need to develop new ones. Look, if you've made it this far, you probably recognize this feeling of living a life that doesn't seem completely yours, like being an actor playing a character you didn't consciously choose. Have you ever caught yourself questioning whether the choices you've made really reflect who you are, or if they were just automatic responses based on old versions of yourself that you're not even sure still exist? I know what this disconnection feels like, as if you were observing your own life from outside, trying to understand who this person is, who makes your decisions and lives your days. If this resonates with you, leave a simple comment. I'm ready to find myself again. Your experience might be exactly what someone needs to read today to feel less alone in this journey of self-discovery. You have more healing power than you imagine. Through decades of observation, Piaget mapped how this flexible construction of identity happens naturally during childhood, but identified specific points where the process can become compromised. One of the most enlightening cases he documented was that of a 7-year-old girl named Simone, who had developed what psychologists today would call paralyzing perfectionism. Simone refused to try any new activity because she had internalized an identity schema based on being the girl who never makes mistakes. Any possibility of failure was interpreted as a fundamental threat to who she was, not just to what she did. Piaget realized that Simone had created an identity schema so rigid that it completely blocked her capacity for growth and adaptation. Working with Simone during several sessions, Piaget developed what would later become one of his most important contributions to understanding healthy identity construction: the concept of flexible equilibration. He discovered that children who developed more resilient and adaptable identities were those who learned to see mistakes not as threats to their identity, but as useful information to adjust and expand their schemas about themselves. Simone had become trapped in what Piaget called defensive assimilation. She only accepted experiences that confirmed her self-image of perfection, rejecting anything that could challenge this limited view of herself. The breakthrough came when Piaget introduced Simone to activities where error was a natural part of the learning process, not a personal failure. He used building games with blocks where the objective was explicitly to experiment, knock down, rebuild, test different possibilities. Through these controlled experiences, Simone began to develop what Piaget called dynamic identity schemas, ways of seeing herself that included growth, change, and experimentation as natural parts of who she was, not threats to her identity. She learned that she could be the girl who tries new things instead of the girl who never makes mistakes, dramatically expanding her capacity to navigate life. This case revealed something fundamental about why you might be feeling lost in yourself currently. Piaget discovered that many adults get trapped in childish versions of identity schemas, versions that might have been adaptive at a certain point in life, but now function as psychological prisons. If you learned as a child that your worth came from being the obedient child, you might have carried this schema into adult life, as being the person who always pleases others, even when this no longer serves your interests or real needs. The schema became automatic, unconscious, and you continue operating through it even when it generates more pain than satisfaction. Piaget identified three main types of obsolete identity schemas that frequently cause this sensation of being lost in yourself. The first type are protection schemas, identities constructed to avoid pain or rejection during vulnerable periods of life, but which now limit your capacity to experience connection and authenticity. For example, if you developed an identity as an independent person who doesn't need anyone to protect yourself from abandonment in childhood, you might now be feeling isolated and disconnected, but unable to access your natural need for intimacy and community. The schema that protected you before now imprisons you. The second type are approval schemas, versions of yourself constructed to gain love, acceptance, or recognition from important figures in your life, but which were never really your conscious choices. You might have become the responsible person, the funny person, or the person who solves problems, not because these characteristics flow naturally from who you are, but because you discovered they generated positive responses from others. Now, decades later, you continue playing these roles automatically, but they feel artificial, as if you were wearing a mask that stuck to your face and you forgot how to remove it. The third type are limitation schemas, beliefs about your capabilities, potential, or rights that were formed in specific contexts, but which you generalized to your entire identity. If you had academic difficulties at a certain period, you might have internalized "I'm not intelligent" as part of your core identity, limiting your willingness to face intellectual challenges for the rest of your life. Or if you grew up in an environment where resources were scarce, you might have developed "I don't deserve good things" as an identity schema, unconsciously sabotaging any opportunity for prosperity or happiness that appears in your life. The genius of Piaget's discovery is that he mapped not only how these schemas form, but how they can be consciously reorganized in adult life. He discovered that the same equilibration process that allows children to develop flexible identities can be consciously reactivated by adults who feel trapped in obsolete versions of themselves. It's not a matter of discovering who you really are, as if there were a true self hidden somewhere waiting to be found. It's a matter of learning to consciously construct updated versions of yourself that reflect who you've become and who you're becoming, not just who you were forced to be at some point in the past. Piaget developed what he called the method of active identity reconstruction, a process by which adults can consciously review and update their schemas about themselves. The first step is what he called ethnographic observation of oneself, beginning to pay attention to your own patterns of behavior, reaction, and decision, as if you were a researcher studying a foreign culture. The idea is to create enough distance between you and your automatic patterns to be able to see them objectively, without judgment, just with scientific curiosity. When you can observe your own identity schemas from outside, it becomes easier to identify which ones still serve you and which have become limitations. The second step is controlled experimentation with new responses, consciously testing small variations in your habitual patterns to see what kind of person you become when you act slightly differently. If you always see yourself as a shy person, you might experiment with making a comment in a meeting. If you've always been the person who solves others' problems, you might experiment with not offering an immediate solution when someone shares a problem. It's not about drastically changing who you are, but about discovering that you have more flexibility and options than your old schemas allowed you to perceive. The third step is reflexive integration, consciously incorporating the results of these experimentations into an expanded version of your self-image. Piaget discovered that most people skip this crucial step. They experiment with acting differently, get positive results, but then return to old patterns because they haven't consciously updated their internal schemas about who they are and what they're capable of. It's like learning a new skill but never seeing yourself as the type of person who has this skill. Reflexive integration involves consciously telling yourself, "This new way of acting is also part of who I am now. My identity includes this capacity." In 1940, already with decades of accumulated research, Piaget encountered a case that consolidated his understanding of how identities can be reconstructed in adult life. Marie was a 35-year-old woman who had sought out Piaget because she felt completely lost after a divorce. She described the sensation of no longer knowing who she was outside the role of wife she had played for 15 years. "It's like I was an actress who played the same character for so long that I forgot who I was before getting on stage," she told Piaget. "But the show is over and I don't know who I am when the lights come on." Marie had built her entire adult identity in function of another person, and now that this person was no longer in her life, she felt as if she didn't exist. Working with Marie over several months, Piaget systematically applied his method of active identity reconstruction. First, he helped Marie identify the identity schemas she had developed during marriage. "I am the person who takes care of others' needs. I am the person who avoids conflicts. I am the person who has no preferences of her own." These schemas weren't necessarily bad, but they had become so dominant that they erased other facets of her personality. Marie had become a one-dimensional version of herself, defined entirely in relation to another person. Marie's breakthrough came when Piaget helped her realize that her schemas of selfless caregiver were actually adaptations to a specific situation, not fundamental characteristics of her personality. She began experimenting with small acts of autonomy, choosing a movie without asking anyone's opinion, decorating a room in the house according to her personal taste, expressing a different opinion in a social conversation. Each experimentation revealed aspects of her personality that had been dormant for years, but were still there, waiting to be reintegrated into her self-image. The most remarkable thing about Marie's transformation wasn't how quickly it happened, but how naturally her authentic personality began to emerge once she gave herself permission to experiment. Within weeks of starting this process, she discovered that she had strong opinions about art, something she had never allowed herself to explore during her marriage. She found herself drawn to abstract expressionism, spending hours in galleries, studying paintings that moved her in ways she couldn't articulate. When Piaget asked her to describe what was happening internally during these gallery visits, Marie said something that became central to his understanding of identity reconstruction. "It's like I'm remembering someone I used to be, but also discovering someone I'm becoming. It's the same person, but more complete." This observation led Piaget to realize that healthy identity reconstruction isn't about discarding old aspects of yourself or becoming a completely different person. It's about what he called schema integration, finding ways to incorporate all the authentic parts of yourself, including aspects that may have been suppressed or underdeveloped, into a more complete and flexible sense of who you are. Marie didn't stop being caring or considerate. She learned to express care from a place of choice rather than compulsion, and to include herself as someone worthy of her own consideration. She didn't reject her nurturing nature. She expanded it to include self-nurturing. Piaget documented that this process of schema integration often reveals what he termed dormant capacities, aspects of personality and ability that were always present but never fully developed because they didn't fit the narrow identity schemas the person had adopted. In Marie's case, her artistic sensibility had been dormant for years, suppressed by schemas that didn't include personal aesthetic preferences as acceptable parts of her identity. But once she began experimenting with autonomy, this capacity emerged naturally, as if it had been waiting patiently for permission to exist. Piaget found this pattern repeatedly. People who felt lost in themselves often weren't missing pieces of their identity, but rather had buried authentic pieces under layers of adaptive but limiting schemas. Through studying cases like Marie's, Piaget identified what he called identity recovery triggers, specific types of experiences that seem to catalyze the rediscovery of suppressed aspects of personality. The first trigger is autonomous choice-making, making decisions based purely on internal preference rather than external approval or expectation. For many people who feel lost in themselves, this is surprisingly difficult because they've spent so long filtering all decisions through what others want or what I should do, that they've lost touch with what I actually want. The simple act of choosing something purely because it appeals to you, without justifying it to anyone else, can begin to reactivate dormant schemas of authentic selfhood. The second trigger Piaget identified is creative expression without evaluation, engaging in activities where the goal is pure self-expression rather than producing something good or impressive. He found that people who felt disconnected from themselves often avoided creative activities because they immediately evaluated their output as not good enough, missing the point entirely. The value wasn't in creating something excellent, but in the process of externalizing internal experience, of giving form to previously unexpressed aspects of themselves. Marie's gallery visits evolved into sketching, then painting, not because she wanted to become an artist, but because the act of choosing colors and forms helped her clarify internal experiences she didn't have words for. The third trigger is boundary experimentation, consciously testing the limits of old identity schemas by doing small things that feel slightly outside your normal character. If you've always seen yourself as not a social person, attending one social event and observing what happens internally. If you've always been the responsible one, letting someone else handle a situation you would normally manage. These experiments aren't about changing your fundamental nature, but about discovering whether the boundaries you've set around your identity are actually authentic limitations or simply inherited assumptions that no longer serve you. Piaget's research revealed that most people who successfully reconstruct their identity go through what he called the discomfort phase, a period where old schemas are loosening but new ones haven't fully formed yet. This phase can feel unsettling because your previous reference points for decision-making and self-understanding are shifting, but you don't yet have stable new ones to replace them. Understanding that this discomfort is normal and temporary is crucial, because many people interpret it as evidence that they're doing something wrong and retreat back to familiar but limiting patterns. During this phase, Piaget observed that people often experience what feels like conflicting impulses, wanting to maintain the security of old patterns while simultaneously feeling drawn toward new possibilities. He found that this conflict isn't a problem to be solved, but a natural part of the integration process. The key is learning to hold both impulses simultaneously without forcing a premature resolution. Marie described it as feeling like I'm two people having a conversation, the old me and the emerging me, and instead of one having to win, they're learning to work together. This internal negotiation process led Piaget to understand that mature identity isn't about finding one true self, but about developing what he called identity fluidity, the capacity to access different authentic aspects of yourself as situations require, while maintaining an underlying sense of continuity and coherence. A healthy adult identity includes multiple facets: the nurturing aspect, the ambitious aspect, the playful aspect, the serious aspect, and the wisdom to know when each is appropriate and authentic. One of Piaget's most profound insights came from observing that people who successfully navigate identity reconstruction develop what he termed metacognitive awareness of their own schemas. They become conscious of their own mental patterns and can observe them with some objectivity. Instead of being completely identified with thoughts like, "I'm not good at social situations," they learn to recognize, "I'm having the thought that I'm not good at social situations. And I wonder where that belief came from and whether it's still accurate." This shift from being your thoughts to observing your thoughts creates space for conscious choice about which mental patterns to strengthen and which to gently update. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond individual psychology. Piaget realized that many of the problems we attribute to personality conflicts or incompatible differences between people are actually conflicts between rigid, outdated identity schemas rather than conflicts between authentic selves. When people learn to hold their own identities more flexibly, they naturally become more capable of understanding and accepting the complexity in others. Marie, for example, found that as she became more accepting of her own contradictions and multifaceted nature, she became much less judgmental of others who didn't fit neat categories. This brings us to perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Piaget's work on adult identity reconstruction. His discovery that the process of finding yourself isn't a solitary journey, but inherently relational. The schemas that make you feel lost in yourself were largely formed in relationship with others, and they can only be fully updated through new relational experiences that provide different feedback about who you are and what you're capable of. This is why Marie's transformation accelerated when she began engaging with people who had never known her in her previous role, people who could see and reflect back aspects of her personality that had been invisible in her marriage. But Piaget found that simply being around new people isn't enough. The quality of attention you bring to these new relationships matters enormously. If you interact with others while still completely identified with old schemas, you'll unconsciously invite them to see you the same limited way you see yourself, recreating the same dynamics that reinforced your restricted identity in the first place. The key is learning to show up with what Piaget called experimental presence, offering authentic aspects of yourself while remaining genuinely curious about how others respond, using their feedback as information about who you're becoming rather than confirmation of who you've always been. This understanding of identity as inherently relational led Piaget to his final and perhaps most important discovery about adult identity reconstruction: the realization that feeling lost in yourself isn't a personal failing or psychological weakness, but often a sign that you've outgrown the relational contexts that originally shaped your identity. Your sense of disconnection from yourself may actually be your psyche's way of signaling that you're ready for a more complex, nuanced, and authentic way of being in the world. The discomfort you feel isn't something to be fixed quickly, but something to be honored as evidence of your growth beyond previous limitations. Marie's complete transformation crystallized this insight for Piaget. After 18 months of conscious identity reconstruction, she had become someone who could embody both her nurturing nature and her artistic passion, both her desire for connection and her need for autonomy, both her caring for others and her care for herself. But the most remarkable change wasn't in what she could do, but in how she held herself in the world. She had developed what Piaget called identity confidence, not the brittle confidence that comes from rigid self-concepts, but the flexible confidence that comes from knowing you can adapt, grow, and remain essentially yourself through life's inevitable changes. When Piaget followed up with Marie 5 years later, he found that her initial identity reconstruction had created a foundation for ongoing growth and adaptation. She had navigated several major life transitions, career changes, new relationships, the loss of parents, not by reverting to old rigid patterns, but by applying the same principles of conscious schema updating that she had learned during her original work with him. She had become what Piaget called a conscious architect of her own becoming, someone who could respond to life's challenges and opportunities with both stability and flexibility. This long-term follow-up research led Piaget to understand that the goal of identity reconstruction isn't to solve the problem of feeling lost in yourself once and for all, but to develop the ongoing capacity to navigate identity challenges throughout life. He realized that in our rapidly changing world, the ability to consciously update your sense of self while maintaining core continuity isn't just helpful. It's essential for psychological health and life satisfaction. People who cling too tightly to outdated self-concepts become increasingly disconnected from their actual experience, while people who change too readily without maintaining any core sense of self become scattered and anxious. The key insight that emerged from decades of Piaget's research is that your sense of being lost in yourself isn't a problem to be eliminated, but a signal to be interpreted. It's your psyche's way of telling you that the identity schemas you've been using are no longer adequate for the person you're becoming and the life you're living. Instead of seeing this disconnection as evidence that something is wrong with you, you can begin to see it as evidence that you're ready for a more expansive and authentic way of understanding yourself. This reframe changes everything about how you approach the journey of self-discovery. Instead of desperately searching for some fixed, true self that you've somehow lost, you can embrace the creative process of consciously constructing updated versions of your identity that honor both who you've been and who you're becoming. Instead of feeling ashamed of your confusion about yourself, you can feel proud of your psyche's refusal to settle for limitations that no longer serve you. Instead of seeing your identity questions as problems to be solved quickly, you can appreciate them as invitations to deeper self-understanding and more authentic self-expression. Piaget discovered that people who successfully navigate this process develop what he called developmental humility, a recognition that identity is never finished, that growth and change are lifelong processes, and that feeling temporarily lost or confused is often the prelude to significant breakthroughs in self-understanding. They learn to see themselves as works in progress rather than finished products, and this perspective allows them to approach identity challenges with curiosity rather than judgment, with experimentation rather than rigidity. The practical implications of Piaget's discoveries extend into every area of life. In relationships, understanding that both you and others are constantly evolving allows for more patience, compassion, and genuine intimacy. Instead of trying to force yourself or your partners into fixed categories, you can appreciate the dynamic nature of human personality and create space for mutual growth and change. In career and creative pursuits, recognizing identity as fluid allows you to explore new possibilities without feeling like you're betraying some essential nature. You can try new roles, develop new skills, and pursue new interests while maintaining a sense of underlying continuity. Most importantly, Piaget's work reveals that the feeling of being lost in yourself, rather than being a permanent condition or character flaw, is often a temporary phase in a larger process of psychological development. Just as children go through periods of confusion and disequilibrium before reaching new levels of cognitive sophistication, adults often experience periods of identity uncertainty before integrating new aspects of themselves into a more complex and satisfying sense of who they are. The journey of rediscovering yourself through Piaget's framework isn't about returning to some previous version of yourself that felt more authentic, but about moving forward into a more complete and integrated version of who you're becoming. It's about learning to hold multiple aspects of your personality simultaneously, to be both consistent and flexible, to maintain a core sense of self while remaining open to growth and change. As you begin to apply these insights to your own experience of feeling lost in yourself, Remember that this process requires both patience and courage. Patience because identity reconstruction takes time, and rushing the process often leads back to rigid patterns that feel safe, but ultimately unsatisfying. Courage because truly knowing yourself requires willingness to see and accept aspects of your personality that may not fit your previous self-concepts, including both limitations you hadn't acknowledged and capacities you hadn't recognized. The most beautiful aspect of Piaget's discovery is that it reveals identity confusion not as a problem to be ashamed of, but as evidence of your psyche's incredible wisdom. Your sense of being lost in yourself is actually your inner guidance system telling you that you've grown beyond previous limitations and are ready for a more expansive way of being. Instead of fighting this confusion or trying to return to simpler self-concepts that no longer fit, you can embrace it as the beginning of a fascinating journey of conscious self-creation. The path forward isn't about finding yourself, but about creating yourself consciously and authentically. It's about becoming the active author of your own identity story rather than a passive character in patterns you inherited or adopted unconsciously. It's about developing the capacity to be genuinely yourself in all your complexity while remaining open to continued growth and evolution throughout your life. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns of identity confusion and feel ready to begin the journey of conscious self-reconstruction, I want you to know that you're not alone in this process. Thousands of people are navigating these same questions, learning to hold their identities more flexibly and discovering aspects of themselves they never knew existed. This isn't just a channel where you'll learn psychological concepts. It's a community where you'll find ongoing support for one of the most important journeys you can take, the journey home to yourself. When you join us by subscribing, you're not just getting access to more content about psychology and human development. You're becoming part of a conversation about what it means to be consciously human in a world that often pressures us to be simple, predictable, and unchanging. Every week, we explore different aspects of psychological growth, always with the understanding that you are not a problem to be fixed, but a person to be understood, honored, and supported in your ongoing becoming. The path of conscious identity development that Piaget mapped out isn't always easy, but it's infinitely more satisfying than staying trapped in outdated versions of yourself that no longer fit who you're becoming. And when you take this journey with others who understand the challenges and celebrate the breakthroughs, it becomes not just bearable, but genuinely transformative. Your willingness to question who you are, to feel temporarily lost in the service of ultimately finding a more authentic way of being, is one of the most courageous things you can do. It takes tremendous strength to admit that the identity you've been wearing no longer fits, and even more strength to begin the process of conscious reconstruction. But on the other side of this discomfort lies a way of being in the world that is more genuinely yours than anything you've experienced before. If you're ready to continue this exploration, our next conversation will dive into Piaget's discoveries about why some people seem naturally resilient while others struggle with every change, and how understanding your own adaptation style can help you navigate life's inevitable transitions with greater ease and authenticity. It's about discovering not just who you are, but how you naturally grow and change so you can work with your inherent patterns rather than against them. The journey of finding yourself isn't a destination you reach, but a way of traveling through life with increasing awareness, flexibility, and self-compassion. And it begins with the simple recognition that feeling lost in yourself isn't a dead end, but a doorway to becoming more fully who you were always meant to be.